I'm going to read the ない form of these two verbs using 3 different pitch patterns. Can you choose the correct one? 行かない、行かない、行かない、書かない、書かない、書かない。The purpose of this video is far more than just revealing the answers. Among all verb-dependent words, the auxiliary verb ない that connects to the 未然形, aka imperfective form, along with its various forms such as なかった、なくて, and so on, actually has the most special pitch accent effect, if you will, on the 未然形 part. Of course, besides ない, the 未然形 can also connect with other dependent words, some of which may completely refresh what you already know. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome to Monochrome Japanese, a peaceful space where you can focus on your Japanese study. I'm your host, Shiho. This is the first episode after the introduction one on pitch accent of verbs. If you haven't watched the introduction episode yet, I strongly recommend doing so before moving on. At the end of that episode, I mentioned that in the upcoming videos, I would explain commonly used dependent words and their pitch accents in the order of conjugated forms, and based on the types of pitch accent interaction between the dependent words and the conjugated forms. So today, we'll start with the 未然形. Before that, let's briefly go over a few concepts as well as the scope of discussion. First, I divide verb-dependent words into 5 categories based on how they interact with conjugated forms in terms of pitch accent, which are collaborator type, follower type, loner type, agent type, and leader type. It's important to know that not every conjugated form can connect with all types of dependent word. For example, the commonly used dependent words that connect to the 未然形, which I've prepared for today's episode, only involve 3 of these 5 types. Of course, I'll cover all of them in future episodes. Second, in my short series, I've already introduced the pitch accents of quite a few verb-dependent words. However, I mostly focused on the conclusions over there. But this series of courses on verb pitch accent is meant to be much more detailed. Finally, including today's episode, the dependent words I list for certain conjugated forms are not a list of everything that can connect to that form. That said, they do cover the vast majority of commonly used dependent words. Alright, let's dive in. First up, ない. Now, this is something to be clear about in the first place. The ない that connects to the 未然形 of a verb is an auxiliary verb. It is not the same as ない in examples like お金がない, which is an adjective. Although, when pronounced alone, both are read as ない. The auxiliary verb ない that connects to the 未然形 is, in most cases, pronounced either high high or low low, depending on whether the verb before it is nucleus bearing or nucleus less. As I mentioned earlier, its pitch accent rules are the most special of all. In fact, among what I call collaborator type dependent words, there's only this one. The collaboration here means that ない and the 未然形 work together to reflect whether the original verb is nucleus bearing or nucleus less. Although it's not as complicated as it might sound to you, I want to emphasize again that in terms of pitch accent rules, this auxiliary verb is truly unique among all verb-dependent words. Specifically, if the verb is nucleus-less, the 未然形 and ない collaborate to maintain that nucleus-less property. In other words, there is no pitch drop across the entire form. So, ない is pronounced high. For example, 言わない、聞かない、消えない、しない。If the verb is nucleus bearing, then the 未然形 and ない collaborate to reflect that nucleus bearing property. Here, the idea of collaboration is even more crucial. Since the verb is nucleus bearing, there must be a pitch drop. Therefore, the 未然形 takes the responsibility for the high pitch, while ない for the low pitch. And the pitch drop always occurs between them. Let's look at some other examples. 帰る、帰らない。作る、作らない。食べる、食べない。来る、来ない。What's especially important here is that for nucleus-bearing group 1 verbs, the pitch accent of the 未然形 changes once ない is attached. For example, 作る becomes 作らない. Even further, for pattern B verbs, whose first mora bears the nucleus, not only does the pitch accent change, but the high-low pattern is completely reversed. For example, 帰る becomes 帰らない. I strongly recommend that you find other similar verbs, preferably commonly used ones, and start familiarizing yourself from today with how their pitch accent changes when they connect to ない. By now, you should all know the correct readings for the examples at the beginning of this video. Let me read all the options once again. 行かない、行かない、行かない。書かない、書かない、書かない。That's right. The correct answers are the third one, 行かない, and the first one, 書かない. However, there is an additional point we need to clarify regarding the pitch accent of nucleus-less verbs 未然形 when connecting to ない. Earlier, we said that when a nucleus-less verb connects to ない, the entire form remains nucleus-less. For example, 言う becomes 言わない. This is perfectly correct. But in modern Japanese, when this auxiliary verb ない appears as the 終止形, aka the terminal form, its pitch accent sometimes behaves like the adjective ない, pronounced high-low. For example, 言わない、聞かない、消えない、しない。However, in the 連体形, aka attributive form, it remains nucleus-less. Like, 言わない言葉、聞かない音楽、消えない匂い、しないこと。Besides, the following forms that connect to the 未然形 are also extremely common. Their pitch accents are not completely identical to ない. I've already introduced them in my short series, so here's a brief summary. When they connect to nucleus-less verbs, they retain their own pattern B pitch accent, as in 言わなかった、言わないで、 言わなくて、言わなければ. When they connect to nucleus-bearing verbs, they become collaborator type. In other words, just like ない with nucleus-bearing verbs, the auxiliary part is pronounced low, while the 未然形 is pronounced high, as in 作らなかった、作らないで、作らなくて、作らなければ. Additionally, still related to ない, I also covered the pitch accents of ず, ざる, and まい in my short series. If you haven't already, check them out too. Alright, next up is よ. You might wonder, wait, isn't this the volitional form? What does this have to do with the 未然形? If that's your reaction, you're not totally wrong. In educational grammar, this is called the volitional form, or more precisely, a verb plus this dependent word is called the volitional form. For example, 行く becomes 行こう. But if we go back to the school grammar, the 未然形 of 行く is 行か, right? Yes, but what many people don't know is that 行かう is actually the original form of 行こう. So, in modern school grammar, group 1 verbs actually have 2 未然形. Taking the nucleus-less verb 行く as an example, they are 行か and 行こ. If you add 行き the 連用形, 行く the 終止形 and 連体形, then 行け the 仮定形 and 命令形. Have you noticed anything? How about this? Exactly. This is why group 1 verbs are called 5-step verbs or 5段動詞 in school grammar. Alright, returning to the 未然形. When the second 未然形 行こ connects with the auxiliary verb う, it forms the volitional form 行こ in educational grammar. How about nucleus-bearing group 1 verbs? Taking 作る as an example. Its second 未然形 is 作ろ and with う it becomes 作ろう. You've probably already noticed that, regardless of whether the verb is nucleus-bearing or nucleus-less, when a group 1 verb connects to う is always low, while the preceding 未然形 is high. Now let's look at group 2 and 3 verbs that connect with よ. The 未然形 of 消える is 消え. So as the final result, the volitional form is 消えよう. Likewise, the 未然形 of 食べる is 食べ. With よ it becomes 食べよう. The 未然形 of する is し and it becomes しよう. The 未然形 of 来る is こ becoming 来よう. Yes, regardless of whether the verb is nucleus-bearing or nucleus-less, う is low, while よ and the 未然形 are high. So, overall, the auxiliary verb う or よ maintains its own pitch accent, and at the same time removes the pitch accent of the preceding 未然形. Dependent words like this are usually called decisive type, which I call the leader type. Besides よ, there are many other dependent words that belong to this category. We'll cover them in future episodes. Also, I already covered the pitch accent of yo in my short series as well, including a slightly special case, so you're welcome to check it out too. Alright, the next two are also a little suspicious. As you might also wonder, isn't this the passive form and the causative form? What do they have to do with the mizenke? Again, you're not totally wrong. Let's take a look at this passive form first. In educational grammar, a verb becomes the passive form when reru or rareru is added. But in school grammar, rather than calling it a passive form, it's more accurate to say that this dependent word connects to the mizenke and have the meaning of passive. However, this form actually has 4 different meanings in Japanese: passive, honorific, potential, and spontaneous. The passive is just our most familiar one. Honorific might not sound completely strange to you, but potential might be a little confusing, while spontaneous might be the strangest. These are all very natural reactions. But since our focus today is pitch accent, let's look at that first. It's actually not that complicated. Reru, rareru acts as an agent, representing the nucleus-bearing or nucleus-less property of the original verb on behalf of the mizenke. As a result, the mizenke itself no longer has a nucleus. This is why I call these type of dependent words the agent type. Let's look at some examples. Iku is a nucleus-less group 1 verb, which becomes ikareru. Kaku is a nucleus-bearing group 1 verb, which becomes kakareru. Hajimeru is a nucleus-less group 2 verb, so it becomes hajimerareru. Taberu is a nucleus-bearing group 2 verb, so it becomes taberareru. Suru is a nucleus-less group 3 verb, becoming sareru. And finally, kuru is a nucleus-bearing group 3 verb, becoming korareru. Alright, there are 2 things to note here. First, when reru, rareru connects to the mizenke, it not only affects pitch accent, but also turns the verb into a group 2 verb, regardless of the original group. This means that if the resulting verb is nucleus-bearing, the pitch accent of nai, te, ta form are worth your attention, as in kakareru, kakarenai, taberareru, taberarete, korareru, korareta. Second, regarding the potential meaning, you might feel that something doesn't quite add up here. In educational grammar, there is a dedicated potential form. For example, kaku becomes kakeru. But in school grammar, when the mizenke of kaku, which is kaka, connects to this dependent word, it becomes kakareru. And if this kakareru also has the meaning of potential, what's the relationship of these two then? Actually, kakeru is the result of a historical morphological change from kakareru. So, in essence, they are the same thing. But in modern Japanese, however, the potential form kakeru in educational grammar has already replaced kakareru. While for group 2 verbs, on the other hand, られる is still considered the only correct form, which is why the well-known ら抜き言葉 is not used in formal contexts. Feel free to learn more about ら抜き言葉 if you haven't come across this term yet. Back to pitch accent. The potential form of group 1 verbs can also be understood through the concept of agent. Like, 行く is nucleus-less, so 行ける is also nucleus-less. 書く is nucleus-bearing, so 書ける is also nucleus-bearing. Once you fully understand れる, られる and its pitch accent behavior, I believe せる, させる becomes very easy, as it is also an agent-type dependent word, and clearly turns any verb, regardless of its original group, into a group 2 verb as well. So, using the same examples, you should now be able to correctly pronounce the pitch accent of these group 2 verbs, which are called the causative form in educational grammar. Alright, that covers the commonly used dependent words that connect to the 未然形 and their pitch accents, which are auxiliary verb ない of the collaborator type, auxiliary verb よ of the leader type, and the auxiliary verb れるられるせるさせる of the agent type. From the perspective how they affect the pitch accent of the 未然形, they actually share one common point. Have you noticed? Yes. That's they either turn a nucleus-bearing 未然形 into a nucleus-less state, such as よ れるられる and せるさせる. Or they shift the pitch accent nucleus to the final mora of the 未然形, such as ない and う. So, as a result, the 未然形 portion is always pronounced high. That's all for today. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to my channel and share my videos with friends who are learning Japanese. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.